Galaxy. Today we are talking about Ruby off the rails, which is a really exciting topic because I think a lot of times when we think about Ruby, we're focused on the context of inside one of its most popular frameworks. But there are a ton of uses for Ruby outside that. Today we're joined by Corey Haines, who's going to talk about how Ruby can be used to automate your life.
Whoa, okay.
Hello.
Hey,
so
Corey.
I think I remember you telling... Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just saying hi to Corey. I've never met you, so I just want to say, like, this is the virtual wave. Hello, hello. Nice to meet you. We'll do the virtual handshake.
I was a little too quick on the trigger there. I jumped in. Okay. Corey Haines, can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, I'm a software developer. I've been developing for a long time and gone through doing trainings, taught other people how to develop software. I've started companies, led teams, things like that. I was one of the co-creators of the Code Retreat workshop, which I'm super proud of, if people have heard of that. And yeah, now I'm sort of taking what I call a retreat into competence sabbatical, where I'm doing contract development work after sort of burning out from starting a company and running a company and burning out. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go back and do hourly, give me money, I'll write code for you. Been doing that for the last couple of years. It's been relaxing and playing with my cats, which is a more important aspect of me, I think, is that I like cats.
Corey, I'm going to also be taking notes just for myself. So if I'm looking down, I'm not transcribing everything you're saying. I'm actually just writing notes. First
okay,
thing,
I have 2 cats. That's an important thing.
2 cats, and top of the list, avoid burnout. I'm excited to
avoid burnout. Cats help.
2 cats. What are the cats' names?
I'm also joined.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Joe.
It's Nickel of Newsy and Little Miss Louise.
Yes, so Nickel of Newsy and Little Miss Louise. I got Newsy 2 years ago. And 2 years ago or last year? 2 years ago. And I forget what his name was at the place, at the treehouse animal shelter. But I didn't like it. And so I was calling him New Cat. And then my best friend, she was like, I just kind of think his name's Nickel. And I was like, eh. And so I was calling him New Cat, and then I would shrink it to NC. And then when my friend said Nickel, I was like, well, I could see that, but I really like NC. And so it turned into Newsy. And so and then of course, cats, he's got to be a sir.
That makes sense.
So, yeah. Okay.
I also forgot to introduce Danny. Danny, my co-host.
Hi, Danny.
Hello, everyone. My name is Danny Ramos, and yes, went through Turing of learning Ruby. So I'm a very Ruby beginner. So Corey, please, I apologize if I'm just like, what does this mean? What does that mean?
No, you went Turing in Denver?
Yeah. Just graduated this last September.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
I used to hang out with Jeff a lot.
Oh, what? Really? Nice.
Oh yeah. Back in the day when we all would hang out at the conferences. Yeah, and saw people in person.
All right. So on to the topic. If I understand correctly, you've been automating something with Bitcoin with Ruby in your life lately?
Yeah, well, it's more of just like the idea of if you find yourself doing something a lot, like write a Ruby script to do it for you. And like the one, I mentioned one thing that like super tiny, like 20-line script that I used to go check because I have like a small bit of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency, not enough to make me like actually care that much, but it was fun to go to the website and check on how much it was. And the thing is, as developers, there's always APIs to look at stuff. And so I just wrote a little script that gets the API, and then of course you make it configurable on the command line and like you know, it can print out. And then I hooked it into an Alfred workflow. So I just use Alfred to do check crypto, and it prints in big, large text what my portfolio is. And, but I think it's a good example of what I think a lot of developers don't think about a lot of times, because they spend, you know, most of the time you're working in a system like Rails or one of those, and you don't think about it as much of like Ruby's a scripting language.
Yes.
Like, it's really fantastic. It's fantastic to take standard in, and it's super great at pushing the standard out. So you can write small focused scripts to do stuff, and you don't have to build big systems. Like I also mentioned, one of the things that I've done, and I know quite a few people have done, is like writing small like task management utilities and stuff that just use a flat file, and it just like you have a bunch of little scripts that you can add or you can delete from it or something, and you don't have to build these big large frameworks, even to the point of like you don't need RSpec to test things. Like you don't need always to have these sort of frameworks. You could just write a little assert equals.
right when you said you don't have to test things, Jill just goes, no.
It's not to test things. Yeah, you don't need RSpec.
Yeah, you don't need RSpec. And I was thinking about it today of like how many people have gone in and like traced, when you do like Rails S to start up a server, what does that do? Like, how do you kick off Rails? Like, what's the flow? Like, because if you start off and live your life like you write just little Ruby scripts that do things, it's pretty easy because you run Ruby and you give it the file name and it runs Ruby. But like understanding how that then leads to starting up something is a really, I think, a valuable thing to look into, because Rails is just running Ruby on a Ruby file. And like, what's that Ruby file do? Like, it's interesting. So and understanding some of those things makes it so that when you want to, like, it takes away that mystery of, could I write something like that? That's like, well, sure you could. Like, why not?
I think this kind of ties back to like RSpec, right? When we were talking about that. Also, I just wanted to note, I built all my Advent of Code solutions in Ruby, and literally I added only one gem, and it was RSpec. So when you said that, it definitely like went straight to the heart, and I was like, but that's RSpec. But like, I hear what you mean, right? Like you can write a method called asserts, and then in Ruby, if you call something like asserts this, it looks like it's something more than a method, right? And I think we especially see this when we're looking at kind of like frameworks and domain-specific languages and things like that, is like validators and like RSpec, they don't look like they're just methods, but that's all they are. Like most of the time we're extending from a base class.
Yeah. And when you get into those, like say RSpec, one of the interesting things is when you really start writing a lot of RSpec tests, you're kind of not writing Ruby anymore. Like, you're writing RSpec. RSpec's a DSL for writing tests. And the underlying syntax is a Ruby syntax, but so often, like when you do describe or you do it or you do expect, these are implemented in Ruby's, but they're really the RSpec language. And it's that interesting idea of how oftentimes if you have a problem, the first thing that you might want to do is write a language that lets you solve that problem easily. And that's what a DSL is for. Like, if you have, I mean, if you think about RSpec as a well-known understanding, before that, and if you look at like Minitest, the way kind of Minitest works is you write functions, and one of the things that Minitest talks about as its good quality is that it's just Ruby. And there's like, you write functions and then it looks for functions that have tests or whatever. Whereas our spec said we have a problem, which is testing. And so we're going to write a language for testing. And then and it's going to be very focused on testing. And so because it's focused on testing, all of the pieces parts fit together. And you're not just sort of like writing a function that ends in test, and then you're, figuring out what are the ways you want to test, for example. Not to say that that's bad or good, because like I like to just write an asserts function and use that when I'm writing stuff. And like advent of code, the first few days, I just had an asserts. But then as things got more complicated, it became smoother if I had a DSL for being explicit about my tests. And that's when I brought our spec in.
Now, hang on a second. Advent of code breaks down into a couple categories of problems, right? There's the first problem, which is always like, get the data from this file and structure it in a way you can use. And then there's the second one that's like, process all of this data in the structure that you use and get the answer. And then there's output the answer in the format that they want, right? All of the problems break down this way. I almost feel like we're reaching a point where we can say you can build a language to handle, and by language here we mean domain specific language, not a different coding language, not a different programming language. Because I think often as developers we think like, oh, I want to change the syntax, I have to build a new language. But with domain specific languages, we're just saying, no, you can write your own syntax.
Yep.
And
Ruby is gorgeous for that.
Yeah. Why is that, do you think?
Well, one, and I've got strong opinions about this in other languages, but the parentheses optional.
Yep.
Make it so that you can have a little bit more fluidity in how it reads. The really strong sort of runtime technical, people call it meta programming, but it's really just programming. And so at runtime, you're doing both changing the program and running the code. So you can actually it's nice because it doesn't have a macro system, which tends to run before. Like you kind of have a two-phase thing where macros expand into code that then runs. Whereas in Ruby, one of the things I love about it is that there can be an interaction between the code that is doing whatever you want it to do, the work, and the code that is making it easier for the code to do the work it needs to do. So the DSL is not built ahead of time. It actually is running at the same time that your code is running. And I love that because then they sort of merge and you can start to think of them around the same time. Which is one of the reasons, in one of the contracts, I built some shared examples in our spec and just added a method that the example's called and didn't have to do anything fancy with it. I just wrote a method, and I knew that when all of the DSL stuff was going on and all the metaprogramming was going on, it still had access to my code. And so it was actually calling my code into it. And I think when you start to think that way about the code that's doing the process and the code that is making it so that the code that does the process is easier to write or all of that, they're the same thing and they're running and they can interact with each other. That I think is really powerful in Ruby, and also just Ruby is a fine, Ruby's intended to be readable. It's intended to write these sorts of things, and so that's a goal of the language. Yes, exactly. So I think that's it, and it just, I don't know. I love Ruby, so.
That was one thing that we would always hear in school was over and over and over, oh, Ruby is nice to you. Ruby is nice to you. and I never really understood that. Because that was like my first experience with any language, so I was like, I don't know, this seems pretty hard anyway. But then once I got to Rails, or later on with like Python or like Node.js, I was like, I miss Ruby. It was nice to me.
Yeah, I think it is more common to find Ruby developers who will tell you they smile when they write Ruby than any other language.
Put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah, I mean, it's built in, Matt says this, it's built, it's optimized for programmer happiness. And it feels that way. Like I do other languages, but I always come back to Ruby because it's like a hug when you write in it. And this is one of the reasons that, kind of going back to like writing really small little scripts with it, is that when you spend all of your time, say in Rails, and both of the contracts I'm doing are Rails apps, and that's kind of a lot of what's out there. You're working within some constraints, and you should be working within the constraints of Rails. And so you bump up against some side things because Rails is optimized. I think, this is just me, I think Rails is optimized for productivity, less so than happiness. And it doesn't mean that Rails doesn't make you happy or it makes you sad, but Ruby is just like, you want to be happy when you're writing this. So getting outside of some of these frameworks that are there to be productive in, and just write fun things on your own that, like, I'm always hitting this website, or I'm always copying these files around, or whatever it is that you find yourself doing a lot on the computer. Jumping back to spending some time writing it in Ruby is sort of like giving yourself a present, because you're going to go back and remember what it was like when you were learning Ruby and was just like, this is a nice language, I love it. And then and the other thing that I like to do is when I'm working in some other thing, like I went through a course on building, basically starting from nothing and building up a computer in a circuit simulator. It wasn't the Nanta Tetris one, but it was this other one. And I wrote a bunch of scripts in Ruby to help run all of the other stuff I was doing, because I found that I was always like making this change or that change, or combining these files, or running this and analyzing. I end up doing this a lot. I wrote a small testing tool in Ruby that would run the circuit simulator and then figure out whether or not it outputted what I wanted it to output. And so Ruby was testing the circuit simulator, or my circuit.
I like that, because it doesn't really matter what you're interfacing with. Also, we have a question from chat. Epicargus here wants to know, what is your favorite Ruby exclusive feature and why?
My favorite Ruby exclusive feature.
Exclusive. It's hard to think of one that's exclusive, isn't it?
Yeah. I wouldn't. So the thing, well, let me tell you when I got into Ruby, because that was the thing that I left C#. I was doing C# for, I don't know, I did C# for about 7 years. And one of the reasons I left C#, this was back in like 2007, was that my style of coding was changing, in that I was starting to move more in sort of like an outside-in TDD style. And whenever I would write something, the C# compiler would yell at me and say, that doesn't exist yet. And so my editor, I would be in Visual Studio, and it was just red squiggly lines. The entire thing was red squiggly lines. And I like to do a style called programming by wishful thinking, which was I used to call it turtles all the way down, but then I watched the structure and interpretation of computer programs course, that the videos that are out there, and they described exactly how I coded and called it programming by wishful thinking. So it's like, I will go with the official name. But you start out and you just write, wouldn't it be nice if?
Mm-hmm. If this did this.
Yeah, like I sure wish I had a function that did this. I don't have it, but I wish I had it. And the C# compiler, by virtue of some of the safeties that it gives you, it goes, that doesn't exist. And I would go, I know.
I'll build it later.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be nice if it did? And then the C# compiler would say, yeah, it would be nice. And it would put a red squiggly line. And so it just, my style as it was changing, sort of moved me away, and I got more frustrated with that. And so at that time, Ruby was really sort of coming into its resurgence, but surging because of Rails. And a lot of people were thinking about it. And when I started working in Ruby, that never happened. Like the Ruby supported the idea of just sort of saying, like, let's just pretend that exists. And Ruby would go, great. So that worked. Mm-hmm.
I really love the way they've constructed the new type system for Ruby, because I think I developed in a similar but almost inverted way, right? Like, I like to sit there and be like, I have a thing. This thing works. It does not return what I want. It doesn't return my results yet, but I'm going to like tack on bits until it does, right? I'll be like, I'm just going to run it on one of these. Or I'll be like, I'm just going to write the loop to iterate through these. And at the entire like phase of it, I'm constantly changing what the return type is, what my inputs are, adding new ones. It's very, very iterative and iterative and iterative. And I feel like with the normal way that static type systems are introduced, you feel very stuck. Like, I'm constantly going back to the method like name, and I'm like, no, it's returning a string now. No, it's returning a string array now. No, it's returning a this. The way Ruby structured it, you can build and develop and experiment and wishful thinking your way through it. And then at the end, you can say, I'd like to harden this with an RBS file.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it can,
that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it comes about. I mean, I do a lot of, I'm a big Elm guys, I always talk about it. And so I really love a good type system. But Ruby's got a different feel to me than it is when I'm coding in like Elm, because I actually my types are generally stand in for a large portion of my tests. My types stand in for. So I actually just write my type signatures for my functions, and those are the tests. And by virtue of kind of how the things work, once the compiler compiles, I'm almost always guaranteed that function works. And so I write so much fewer tests, but also in languages that are not like in a functional language, I think it probably works a little better when you're building in a functional style, because there's less side effects, things like that. So you kind of know that if you say you get a list in and you get back an integer, like when that type system or the type signature like passes in the compiles, you're pretty much sure you have count or length, because you can look at the code and say it's not returning 0, which would be something that would work, but like it's returning length. That's what that function by the type signature, it has to be length. And so yeah, it's an interesting thing. I'll be curious I've not tried out RBS at all, because I like the freedom. And
I saw the talk at RubyConf, and I was like, thank you. I was basically like, I can ignore them.
and I think they'll come in really handy with, like you said, it tightens things up. And so it hardens it in where one of the things I like about Ruby, and this is why it's so hard to like be very like what is an exclusive Ruby thing, is that I think so much of the parts of Ruby work together to make a very it's kind of a freewheeling lifestyle when you're writing Ruby. And it's just it's different from like there's
Sharp
some
knives.
languages that are like Wild West, I hope I don't get shot. Whereas Ruby feels like just a freewheeling, like I'm out having a good time feeling when you're doing it. And so much of it comes in like being able to define methods on the fly. I like that. Do I do it a lot? No, but it's nice to be able to do that. And like being able to loop over. So one of the things that I love to be able to do, and this goes into where the meta programming and programming it's all just programming, is that case where you need to write a test over like you have 5 different values you need to test. You could just make a hash that has the value in the expected, or the expected value.
Oh yeah.
And just write that, and then dot each, and then inside your block, go
Loop over it.
Does it. And so you can write your tests inside a loop, and because it's all running at the same time, it's fine. Like the it is not some special thing like you mentioned earlier. It's just a function.
It's just a function. We have the power. We don't have macros, but we can get the same functionality through metaprogramming. Also, we have a question from Saint Decoder and then a comment from Apicarcassir. So Saint Decoder says, what was the project you created that made Ruby click for you? Danny, do you have one?
Yeah, I was about to say, like, I'm still, waiting for that click to come, but it was really fun to build Battleship. We built Battleship in Ruby, and that was really cool to see like all the different relationships between classes and just really like, and then building something that looked pretty bad and then abstracting that and making it into its own little separate classes, and then trying to remember even how you play Battleship was kind of a challenge in itself. But
you learn all of the side rule, like the edge case rules of
Battleship. Yeah. I was like, okay, well, for this game, you can sync with one hit. But
did you generate the map?
Yeah, we generated the map. So it printed out on the terminal.
I like that. That's fun.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, I think so. So the first Ruby code I ever wrote was actually RSpec. Like a friend of mine was like, I was good friends with David Chelimsky, and whenever I would see him,
just a low key flex.
Well, this was like 2004. We all were like there was no that.
You're just like, I don't need, like, you started this by saying, I don't need RSpec. Like, it's not important. And then we get halfway through and it turns out, I don't need RSpec because I wrote part of it. I can just rewrite the parts that I want.
Let me rephrase that. I didn't write part of RSpec. David was a friend of mine from before RSpec days. And whenever I would see him, like I lived in Cleveland, he lived in Chicago, and we would go to conferences, agile conferences and stuff, and we'd see each other. And whenever we would see each other, he always coded. Like he was always coding, and he was always stuff. And I would walk over, and it was inevitable that I would say, "Hey, what you doing?" And he would say, "Sit down." And then we would pair for a while on it. And that's how I learned about Ruby. Really was, what are you working on? And he's just like, "Oh, I'm working on RSpec." And so he kind of taught me the initial stuff about Ruby. And this was when I was doing C# full time. And then that kind of got me out of C#. I got a job doing Ruby. I spent a year learning Ruby and Rails, and then got a job at a startup doing Rails, and wrote some horribly C#ish Ruby because I had a very sort of established style in C#, and wrote some really bad stuff. Got fired from that place. Not because of my code. Not because of my code. But so what I think was the one that like clicked. Like I was like, I know Ruby pretty well, is the first sort of startup I did. This was in 2010. So my partner at the time, who's now my best friend, she and I decided to build a tool called Mercury app. And it was based on something she had written before. And what it is it's a way to track how you feel about things over time. And so there's a website. You sign up and you say, here's the topic, and it would email you every day and say, how are you feeling today about it? And you would respond with a number, and then it made nice graphs, and you could leave notes and stuff.
Does that
great.
Does that website still exist?
Yeah. It's if you go to mercuryapp.com, bringing it down pretty soon. But
should we check it out?
It's been up for a long time. I would say don't use it because of the fact that I keep threatening to just drop it down or to take it down, because it's Ruby 187, and I think it's Rails like 3.1 because Rails had just come out, or like Rails 3 had just come, and so we chipped in that. But we were building it together, and she's a developer, fantastic developer, and that's where like building that really solidified Ruby for me, because it was just the two of us, and we had to build all of this stuff out. So we had to learn really how to be effective at Rails. And so I would say that was the one. And it goes along with that thing that everybody says, which is find a project and work on it. Like find something that you want to build and build it.
Would you suggest working on a project with a partner? Because I amend you to that, because I'm just learning, and my girlfriend is a very good Rails developer, and I can just see in her eyes like, you type really slow.
Yes. Yes. So the things I learned, this was my first like startup that I had done as well, and hers as well. And things I learned about, we had actually worked on a side project before called the Stickies project, and it was building basically an online sticky paper app.
Oh.
And she had built a version of it before, and we were like, let's rebuild it. And so we'd worked on that, and the lessons that I learned over the first two things we built were, always make sure you're on the same page as to why you're building this. Because when we were building the Stickies project, it was, sticky papers, and when you drag a sticky paper onto another, it would stick and they would move together and all that. And I was just having a good time writing code. She wanted to get it done. And so I would like write something. We would write something because we were pairing. And then the next day I would come back and be like, you know what? I want to rewrite that. Which is frustrating when your partner is saying that and you are like, your goal is to finish. And I was just like, I really would like to figure out how to test JavaScript. And so it would be constantly coming back with like, I don't like that way. And like I built a SPY test double framework or library for it, and was doing all of this stuff, which is so bad. And then we laugh about it now of not knowing, like now, 10 years, 12 years on, we laugh about it, but yeah. And then, yeah.
I did that to Danny on Tuesday. I dragged him through like a refactor of our RubyGalaxy, of like the RubyGalaxy site, when we were supposed to just be updating it to reflect like version 3.0.
Oh God. Yeah. And it was just like, you're familiar with liquid tags, right? I'm like, yeah, no, yeah, I got you. And then like I was trying to work on it last night, and I was like, hey, I'm just gonna tweak the HTML. I'm not really figuring it out right now, and I just need to push these changes. And Rachel's like, okay, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, it's
Well, I did the exact same thing that Corey did. I was like, we want to like rewrite this, and you're like, no, we need to get this done because we've got a thing tomorrow.
yeah, it's so easy to do that. But like, if you're on the same page, and like, I have tons of stories of startup mistakes with a partner, but 12 years on, we're best friends still, so it's kind of like, in the end, it worked out. But doing a startup is hard. All normal, but it's harder when you live with the person that you're doing it with and you have different opinions on things.
Yeah, my girlfriend works for a startup, and previously she had worked for like a pretty established company, and the startup, I could just see like the intensity level changing, and her always wanting to get things done. And I can't imagine the two people working in the same company under like the same roof just being like bouncing around and be like, we need to get this done, we need to get this done, we need to get this done. And be like Saturday night at midnight, be like, hey, maybe we can watch like a TikTok video or something.
You have time for one TikTok video.
One TikTok video.
She's got to.
We go back to. Is that what you said?
She was like looking all cool. She's like, hey, I've only worked for this company for about 5 months, but guess who just hit their 200 commit mark? And I was like, cool.
Nice.
Oh, that's impressive.
Yeah,
because that also means that she cut them correctly.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
That means they're small, focused commits.
Yes.
Yeah, that.
A nice thing though is that if you're with your partner, like we started working on Mercury app, her mother lives in Connecticut in a cabin in sort of this small town on a like 2 acres or something, and we went up there for a week and sat on the balcony, and like that's where we did like Rails New. And so we just spent a week in the summer in the woods of Connecticut building together, which is a fantastic thing to do, and it's even more fantastic when you're with your partner.
I hear these stories about like the golden days, and I'm just like, where have all the good days gone? Like, I keep working at these companies that are like, here, we need you to work until like very late at night. Don't worry, you have unlimited vacation, but we need constant like PRs out of you and all this sort of stuff. And I'm just like, I want to go to a cabin. I want to go to a cabin and write some code. Also, we have been neglecting Epic Arcuseer's well thought out comment.
Oh yes, okay.
I always had the feeling Ruby has more built-in methods for all objects than other languages I've tried, but I have no clue if it's true. This actually, when we were talking about our favorite parts about Ruby, is one of my favorite parts, is enumerable in string. It's just, it's got everything. Yeah.
And because it bounces between like being a general purpose language, but also a scripting language, there's things in it that you're like, why is this here? But it's like, oh, it makes sense in a certain context, and it makes life super nice. Like integer has a next function. Like that's awesome. And how often do you use it? Not that often, but when the time comes, it's like, and I want to do like a group by a property or something and have it turned into a hash. Like it's there.
Done.
Tally. Tally's I think
Tally?
new in 2.7. Tally will take on, and it basically is how many times does a certain value appear in your array. And it returns you a hash of the value and the count.
Oh my gosh.
And it's like these things
It's like they
are...
sat there and they said, we know you're going to do a group by. We can make it even easier. We're just going to go ahead and go to the final, like, we're going to wrap group by and just go ahead and do the count for you. I love it.
This is, I think, one of the really great things that Rails influenced on the Ruby community, and like back, I mean, they're kind of very similar now or overlap, but active support was so focused on really useful things that you're going to do, and a lot of those things got brought back into Ruby, into the core library, and so having that.
This is really interesting because being just new and new to Ruby or have learned Ruby, a lot of the things like with learning a language as a beginner, for me, I found that I assumed that just like other languages had these things. Like I just like, oh, they must just be a different ways of typing stuff. Or like I didn't realize that there's like unique things to specific languages like this. Or I was just like, oh, I thought JavaScript just had different syntax.
No. Capitalize something in JavaScript and you'll understand. There's an entire library called underscore in JavaScript that basically recreates enumerable.
And that's the thing, like enumerable is so great. And just
so
the
good.
pipelining of things, and you don't get that. Like Python doesn't really have something as smooth as that because Python doesn't have blocks.
Oh,
and
blocks.
So it's harder to do that. And so it's the same sort of thing of like, if you compare languages that have a pipeline operator, which lets you basically pipe data through functions, similar to enumerable, but not quite. And if you have a language that is that does like currying by default, then the pipeline operator is just a function that takes two functions, or it takes a function and a data. But if you have a language that doesn't have currying by default, then you have to write a macro for your pipeline. So like Elixir has to have a macro for their pipeline operator, which runs at a different time than everything. Whereas like Elm or other functional languages have it there. And it's just a different feel. It's not, I like it better when you have currying by default, but it's not like it's not objectively better. But the feel is a little bit different. And that's the same with like Ruby having all of these built-in things. Is you can get them or a reasonable thing or facsimile in other languages because they're all just languages, but they're not as smooth and they're not necessarily as integrated into the language itself. And so it's definitely a Ruby thing.
That's a Ruby thing. Now that I think about it, the blocks and the ampersand : method ones. Oh, that one's my favorite. I love to drop like a nice little map on an array and be like, pull this value or this attribute, and like.
The thing that is frustrating. Oh, sorry, I have a catnip banana. I have like they're just all lying around my house, so I'm fidget with them. The thing that frustrates me is that there's not a really streamlined syntax for use a method from my surrounding scope. So when you do like an ampersand : it's saying this is the function or the method I want you to call on the object that's coming in, the argument to the map. But oftentimes I'll have a function outside just in that context that I want to apply. So it's I want to apply this function to everything in there, which is not as
build the whole block.
Yeah. And so that's actually one of those things that if you do it a lot, Ruby makes it easy to build, like write a little function, write your own sort of mappish kind of thing that lets you do it. But yeah, it's just not as that's something that when I need it, I'm always just like, But that being said, 2.7 now has like the _1, _2 for the positional arguments in your map. So you don't have to map and then like in pipes put the name of your parameter, which is always the like singular version of the plural of what it is. You don't have to do that anymore. You can just call the function and put _1. And I use that in the Advent of Code stuff, and it really cleans it up a lot. Cleans it up quite a bit. So I like that. And one might argue that that's a nicer solution than being able to reference things. One might. I don't know if I would, but I might. Depends on how I feel. Because it actually looked really nice. I did like that a lot. And having it not look the same as I want you to call this on each thing that's coming in, but rather I want you to apply it to each thing coming in. If those were similar syntax, it might be confusing about which one you mean. So if it was just like, instead of ampersand colon, it was star colon or something. Like
stars taken by argument deallocations.
Yeah.
Maybe
so,
up arrow? Caret?
Up arrow, yeah, something like that.
Yeah, like you have caret, colon, and then a method.
But then I bet I'd get grumpy about it because it looks like ampersand. It's just like, it's not the same. Blah, 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 blah.
You know what, though? Like, you don't necessarily know what parameters that method accepts.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem. Like, if you've got 1 or 2 parameters or something like that.
Yeah. So I kind of like that explicit. It was the first time I'd really done it. And it made just like long, chaining enumerable functions along. Made it really pretty.
Pikando Kudiko says, is it worth writing a DSL in Ruby just for fun, like for the learning experience? I feel like I should.
Yes. I'm never one to say should. It's very judgy. I always feel judgy because I always say should about myself and then I don't do it because I'm lazy.
So, she says I should remove it from my vocabulary.
I always try to not use should. Tangentially, stop using should in your test descriptions in RSpec. If you still do it, like,
it's expect.
It's it, and then you put does something, because the expectation is that this is green and that this is a statement of fact. And if it's green, it shouldn't should do it. It is doing it.
Yeah, maybe
so,
it maybe does
running,
this.
Like, it's a statement of fact. It's an example. That's why it's called an example. It's like, this is an example of how it works. It's not an example of what it should do. So just say it, blah, blah, blah. It does something, write it out. Anyways, back to the question. Yes, it is valuable to write a little DSL. Find an interesting problem that you have, an interesting domain, not a big one, but just a small one. And write out on paper how you would like to solve this problem. Like and this is again back to that wishful thinking of write out the syntax that would make this nice. And then slowly, incrementally build that DSL.
Are you familiar with liquids, Corey?
No? Maybe? No? What's liquids?
They're used in Shopify and they're used in dev.to.
Liquid tags.
I should probably have answered it for like the guests here anyway. So what liquid tags are is you have your little you have like your curly braces, your modulos, and then you have something like Twitch and a clip ID, and then you'll have something like GitHub and then a GitHub URL, and then you'll do something like GIST and a GIST ID. So with these liquid tags, what happens is they embed a different template based on that. Is that technically a DSL?
Yes.
That's used specifically for templating and formatting?
Yeah, absolutely.
I never thought about it that way. I was like, this is its own unique concept, separate from the rest of programming. But no, it's just a DSL that fits in templates.
That generates something. It's and the thing is a DSL is not something magical. It's just code that
feels that way.
Generally it's code that maybe generates other code, or it's code that just runs in the background that saves you time. The nice thing about this idea of building your own is that you can, build out the syntax you'd like, and there are so many examples. Like look at how Jekyll does its stuff. Look at examples of how the liquid tags underneath, like how it interprets these things. Because it's been a long time since I wrote a liquid tag, but I think it's just a class that has a method that gets called with the parameter. Yeah, and you write Ruby behind the scenes, and that's a really nice way of seeing that. Like it's just Ruby. It's just, there's something that comes through. Maybe it uses like method missing and looks and sees like, oh, you're calling something I don't know. Do I have a tag registered that is that name? And if so, I can instantiate that object, pass the parameters and call your function. And then whatever comes back out, I just plop onto the page. And so you can do these really nice things. And the thing about writing your own is that a lot of times you end up writing your own, but just not like this full-blown, I'm writing a DSL, but you
don't think about it.
You don't think about it. If you write a helper function to do something, it's the beginnings. Like, I don't want to get into definitions of DSLs and all that, but that's kind of you named something. It's the first step. Like, it's a function that does something for you. That's a first good thing. And so if you wrote yourself a small DSL, you would learn techniques that you aren't going to learn by like writing a Rails app. But those techniques can come in and be really handy when you need to pull them out of your toolbox. And you're like, I need to do this. Great.
This ties back to a lot of the stuff you've done with Code Retreat. Danny, are you familiar with Code Retreat?
No.
Do you want to describe it?
I was like, I don't know if they heard me.
Code Retreat's a workshop that's focused on practicing the idea of like going too far with design techniques. And like, we say things like, don't use a lot of if statements or don't have long methods. So like, what if we go too far and like have line functions be 2 methods long or no if statements? And Code Retreat's a day-long workshop where we practice those things, and you pair up and you swap pairs and stuff. And so it happens a lot. They've actually started, the big one nowadays is there's an annual day where a lot of people do it. A lot of cities do it together, but a lot of places around, you can go to. I don't have anything to do with it anymore, so I don't have a stake or anything, but it's a really good, fun workshop day. So if you're in, especially if you're in Europe, they happen a lot more in Europe now because there's a lot more people there that are driving it.
Never mind.
Oh.
Danny fixed it. We had a momentary visual bug there.
Yeah, that was, but we're all good now. I appreciate you breaking down a Code Retreat for me. I now have this idea of like trying to build my own DSL. So.
Well, the reason I wanted to ask about and kind of mention Code Retreat is I know in the past you've talked a lot about how Code Retreat trains you to use those techniques in the future. Yeah, and that's the thing is like if you try these things and you do them over and over again in a sort of a constrained environment, I like to say that the techniques that are really your own, the ones that you can say, this is how I program, are the ones that you use when you have a deadline approaching. Mm-hmm. Like everybody falls back to that, and everybody wants to build beautiful systems, but when it's got to get done today, you fall back to what you know. And the way that you can improve that is by practice. Like if you have written in a certain style enough times, then you don't have to think about it. I always, one of the things I say is it's under your fingers. Because like if you're playing, like I've been learning piano for the last few years, and there are certain moves that happen now that I don't even have to think about. Like I can give you a G chord in every inversion without thinking about it, and I don't have to think about what the notes are because I've played it so many times that it's there under my fingers. Right. But at the beginning, I would have to think about it, and when the pressure was on to play something, I couldn't just play G. Yeah, when everyone was over for dinner and they're like, "Oh, you've been learning piano. Play something." Like, okay, everyone stand over there, turn around. Yeah. Yep. And it's the same with techniques. Oh yes, tell the story. I've told this story before. I learned Happy Birthday and I spent 2 weeks practicing it to go play it for my friend, but under pressure in the moment, like 2 weeks wasn't enough. And my friend was a music teacher and I'm playing her Happy Birthday on my ukulele and I couldn't like get it right. Like I didn't have the timings off. And so literally at her birthday, she is like coaching me through how to play Happy Birthday for her.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah, so I definitely hear what you're saying about like training those techniques so that in the moment you aren't embarrassed at your friend's birthday party.
Yeah, and like I always reach for enumerable. My preferred style is taking problems and looking at them as data transformations. And so I have like when everything comes to head, I will just start chaining enumerable functions together. And
I saw that in your Advent of Code solutions.
Yeah, it's like I don't, and this is the thing is like a lot of people are uncomfortable with like fold, which is reduce or inject, whichever language you're in. People are kind of uncomfortable with it, which is one of the reasons that Ruby got each with object, because people were uncomfortable with fold, I think.
No, I think you are absolutely right. Yeah, like I have been writing Ruby code for like 4 years now, and to this day, I cannot write reduce and have it do what I expect it to do. Every single time I write it, it turns out wrong.
And that's the thing, is like I've used it so many times that my mind goes to it, and I know how to string along a bunch of enumerable methods, you know, maps and folds, to get to what I want. And that is almost always, and it's interesting because I never reach for a for loop when the pressure's on, because I get confused around for loops because I've not used them in so long. Not like I used to use them, but I've used the enumerable methods in Ruby for so long, and that those are the way that I...
Oh, you mean like an actual for loop, not an each loop.
Yeah, like a for loop. I don't know this. I've had to look up the syntax for a Ruby for loop.
This is true. I don't think I've ever used like a proper for loop. Like I've been doing ranges with each.
Yeah. I don't use each that often, which is interesting. Like I move towards, I tend to use map over each. But and not to lead that like it's better, but more that that's what I've done so much is better. But I've done it so much that that's my tool. That's the tool I use when the pressure is on. And different people have different ones, but that comes from practice. That comes from understanding it. And so, yeah. So write a DSL.
DSL.
A long loop back to the answer. Write it. It'll teach you what you need. Write more of them. And last but not least, write your DSL and then delete all the code and write it again. And the thing I would say is find the small thing. Learn how to write it. Delete it. Learn how to write it again. Delete it. And get to the point where you can just write it without thinking about how to write it.
Yeah, the piano keys. That was a big thing I had to learn for myself, was just, I spent all this time on this code. If I delete it, it's gone forever. Oh, yeah. But it's like, no. Code is cheap. It's fine. You can just wipe it and then do it again.
One of the lessons in Code Retreat, that a big lesson was you delete your code every 45 minutes. And so like lots of people over the years had trouble with that, but at the end of the day, most everybody was like, oh, I feel so great deleting code. So awesome.
That makes sense. Corey, where can people find you?
I am on Twitter at Corey Haines, and pretty much everywhere I'm Corey Haines. And also, if you're interested, I'll hawk my little side project newsletter that I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm doing a weekly short newsletter where I'm learning lesser known languages and writing about what's cool about them, that I'm learning what's cool about them. So I'm currently on a language called Icon. This is the first one I'm doing, and it is awesome. And so I'm just writing every week a short thing about, like, here's the cool thing. Unsurprisingly, the next couple weeks are writing a testing library in it, because I want to write a JSON parser, but I need a testing library, and it doesn't have a testing library. So I've got to write one, and it ends up being a rabbit hole, of course. So
from the very beginning with the JavaScript testing library to now.
Yes,
thank you so much
exactly.
for joining
Thanks
us.
for having me. Good talking to you. I am here. And have fun.